He's got a degree from LSE in Management and Entrepreneurship and a string of other degrees which I won't mention. Trust me, they are there. So let me invite Christian to take the stage and to address you on the forces disrupting society, politics and economics. Christian, over to you. Please make him welcome.
Well, thank you so much, John, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Yes, I got a cosmetic surgery, so I look younger than it sounded from the description. But I have the real pleasure today to talk about the forces disrupting society. So the idea was really to say, how do you kind of set the stage a little bit for what is ahead for management education, which Sandra then will take into the actual kind of into the actual curricula. So I try to kind of hopefully describe some of the bigger changes that we're seeing. Over the last 8 years, as John mentioned, we've developed an innovation center at the London School of Economics where we looked into what are the biggest trends in social innovation, innovation, and entrepreneurship. We did a couple of courses around this, and we will launch a new Master in Social Innovation this year, which will hopefully bring a lot of that together, led by Harry Barkemer, who some of you might know from the Rotterdam School of Management, who's now at the LSE as well. So I hope to kind of bring together a bit of the insights from business and then from the kind of teaching and research that we've been doing. So in terms of the bigger challenges, I mean, we're all aware of this, right? We did a study with a couple of CEOs around the world, and I think it's no surprise what the bigger challenges are that are mentioned, everything from social and environmental challenges, finite resources, particularly given the new leadership in some countries, kind of the question of climate change and all these related issues, the networked economy, so we'll talk about the sharing economy, but also then, of course, still the question of how the base of the pyramid, so the poorest of the poor, can be better integrated, not only as consumers, as Prahalad and others were focused on, not only as producers, so in a kind of supply chain, but particularly as entrepreneurs, micro-entrepreneurs. We also see technological environments, artificial intelligence, and then of course shifts in mindsets and needs of these kind of millennial generations. I recently learned about Generation Alpha, which apparently is the 0 to 5 years old. So it seems there's a lot of new generations evolving. But so we'll talk about this a bit more. But so as kind of the macro trends that force organizations to innovate, and then as a kind of consequence that then force universities, of course, to adjust their curricula to that. So the first interesting development is obviously the sharing economy, which is this huge, huge socio-economic ecosystem that is built around this idea of sharing human and physical resources. And it's based on this idea that there's more than 3.5 trillion resources out there that are unused, right? I mean, if you think about your car, 90% of the time probably not in use, house, 50% not in use, all these different resources that we use as consumers, but also businesses. When you operate a crane business, the crane might be in use during the day, but then at night, it's a huge idle resource. So the idea is to say, okay, how do we build platforms around the sharing of these resources, both human and physical? And so some of the examples in the B2b sector, so business to business, where the reasons are obviously around cost effectiveness, where they are around the question of how to pay when needed, have quick response times, where the whole idea is to shift from ownership to access. So how do we essentially get away from this idea that we have to own the resource to actually needing the access to that resource? So there's different examples here. For example, Flow2. Flow2 is an organization or a platform that allows organizations to share their assets. So let's say you are this crane manufacturing company who has a couple of cranes idle during nights, and maybe there's another company that has a permit to use cranes at night or to build at night. Then they might use that crane during the night and then give it back in the morning, pay for that kind of resource use, and essentially make better use of these resources that might have idle times. So it goes beyond the B2C idea of Airbnb and others to really say how businesses work with businesses to really integrate that into one. So we see that with B2C, of course, as well. We're all aware of these new emerging, everything from Airbnb to Lending Club, where people give loans to each other, to TaskRabbit, and even something I discovered recently, which is this, sharedearth.com. Did anyone come across sharedearth.com? No? It's essentially, it shows how far this sharing economy is going, where essentially people who have a garden rent out their garden to people who would love to be a gardener for a couple of hours. So essentially, you even rent out your gardens nowadays. So you can see that this goes across many fields and across many areas. So this is the first big shift, like this kind of sharing economy where technology allows us to do that. The second big shift is the digital transformation we're seeing. So one of the organizations that we've studied over the last years and that we've been working with is Haier in China. And Haier is this huge white goods company. So they have over 70,000 employees. They just bought General Electric's appliances unit. So they're they want to become this global player and are already leading in white goods. And what they say now is, actually, we don't want to be a product company anymore. We want to become an internet company. And what that means is that because now these refrigerators with artificial intelligence potentially become the hub of the house, you essentially connect, obviously, the refrigerator to the washing machine, to other devices. And if you're now a food company, say, the food company needs to be shortlisted on this refrigerator. If you're not shortlisted, potentially, you might lose out in terms of getting that food to the consumer. So the idea of Haier is now to say, okay, how can we develop platforms and ecosystems that allow us to use these different products that we have as platforms and then have micro-entrepreneurs around this. So people who pitch their ideas, so let's say our data tells us that people eat halloumi at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then maybe there is an entrepreneur who says, great, I want to build a halloumi business that caters at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so the idea is that then these ideas get financed by Haier, and Haier wants to after phase out employees and hire entrepreneurs, or rather invest into entrepreneurs that then cater to their markets. So what you see is a shift from a traditional hierarchical organization to a networked organization that becomes more of an investor, where now they invest into the best ideas, but they are usually outside the company and only integrated via these different support platforms, such as finance, such as some of the HR support and administrative functions. So I think Haier is one of these examples where it's really interesting to see how this kind of more networked economy plays out in practice with very traditional products that now are used with artificial intelligence to really develop a networked company. We'll talk about this more in a second, but this is a huge shift, like this whole digital transformation that's super interesting and super intriguing to observe. A third shift is something we labeled the Generation Y question mark. So it's not a generation, it's not the 20 to 30-year-olds, but it's a mindset. It's the mindset of people who question things, a mindset of people who don't take it for granted anymore that companies are there to make a profit, but in a way, those that go back to, the kind of initial Adam Smith writings on moral sentiment, on, these writings that were more about that companies in the end are there to cater to society. And then over the last years, we had this means-end inversion where, we somehow had money as the kind of one parameter of success, but actually, do we really take that for granted? Or, as this kind of Generation Y does, says we want to combine meaning and money. And the interesting thing is what they face, obviously, is I guess most of you came across, the very old Maslow hierarchy of needs. So this idea that as human beings, we first need to fulfill our material needs, then our safety needs, then our esteem needs, and then if we still have time one day, then we self-actualize. So someone like Bill Gates, first building Microsoft, making money, then setting up a foundation and giving it all back. So you first do well, then you do good. It's a relatively linear approach to life. If you have a car accident before, or if you have something else before, you might only fulfill the first bit of the hierarchy. It's relatively linear, and it's relatively self-centered. we believe this generation, in a way, develops this enlightened circle of needs, where they want to fulfill these needs at the same time, but they also understand that in a knowledge economy, it is in my enlightened self-interest to be not too self-interested. Because the more I can cater in a knowledge society, the more I can then receive, because people have an incentive to cater more to me. We'll talk about this later when talking about networks, where you can see supernodes, that those supernodes usually position themselves as givers a lot of times to then actually also be able to take more. This is also something, so we had a lot of really interesting debates about is that something that applies more in the Western context, people who can afford it. But actually, so a couple of projects we've been doing, particularly the last 5 years in Kenya and South Africa, in low-income contexts there, in the Cape Flats, for example, we've seen that if you take an organization like R-Labs, which I mentioned in a second, essentially what you see there is how wrong a lot of NGOs have been going. Because the assumption was always, oh my God, we go into a low-income context, and it's all about better nutrition. It's all about better food. It's all about healthier food. But actually then, when you see what people really value, it is something around dignity. It is something around being able to teach their children something. It is something that is much deeper, that we would consider almost self-actualization in a way, but it is at the core of meaning, right? There's an amazing, I don't know, who of you read Viktor Frankl, the book, Search for Meaning? When I read it, I almost, it's one of these books which you read, and then you say, oh my God, like it just articulated everything you believe in. And so it's my Bible now under the bed to read it every time. And I'll talk about it later more, but he articulated this whole idea that essentially why he thinks he survived the Holocaust and he survived difficult times was that he always kept hope and meaning on different levels, the duality of meaning on the individual level and the kind of higher purpose level. And so essentially with this kind of, in low-income contexts, what we see a lot is that interesting organizations like R-Labs, they don't cater only to, hey, here's better foods, but they cater to how can we develop teachers within the community to then teach others. And then for these teachers, the income is a nice aspect. But for them, what the biggest life improvement is when you measure it, the biggest life improvement comes from, I am now going to my grandparents or my parents and I can teach them something. I'm worthy of something. I'm now someone who's not a former drug dealer, but I'm a teacher now. And this idea of essentially that someone sees themselves now as someone who's valuable and who can produce not only, but who's value to society, shifts the whole mindset of these communities. And so essentially saying that this cycle of needs or circle of needs applies in the West, but also in low-income contexts where we might assume that people are looking at the lower categories only, but actually when you look at mental health and other questions, they are all rooted in the idea of not having meaning, not having purpose, not having a certain, or a lot, and of course not medical, but psychologically in the idea that there is a lack of fundamental meaning. The interesting thing then is, what does that mean? So if we look at these different trends, so let's say the sharing economy, the digital transformation, these kind of different mindsets emerging. And so we believe there's 5 key factors that are shaping organizations that came out of some of the recent studies, especially at Leaders on Purpose, where we work with executives at larger organizations, and then from social entrepreneur studies that is more focused on smaller organizations. Unfortunately, we don't have time today, but if you're interested, I'd be very excited to talk more in private conversation. But the core idea is that these organizations have different pillars and different aspects that they can tweak from action-driven purpose. So why are we here and why should people really care? There's this, did anyone come across the dancing guy on YouTube? No? So the dancing guy, it's essentially, it became a running TED Talk sensation at some point, because what essentially, there's this guy in a park, and he dances crazily, and everything's, oh my God, what a freak, what is he doing there, he's stupid. You can see people like ugh. And then at some point, a second person joins in, and the second person embraces the first person embraces the second person, and so they dance together. And then the second person asks his friends to come in. So these two guys come in. They ask their friends to come in. And after 2 minutes, half of the park is running into the middle because now the out-group became the in-group and the in-group became the out-group. And we've seen that with interesting ideas within organizations, particularly related to how to bring more purpose into organizations. It always sounds a bit hippie at the beginning, right? It always sounds like, oh my God, but you don't realize that real business is about profit. It's about, it's about the hard things. But then once the first crazy people start to question that and start to really embrace people around this, you can see this trigger effect where then having these key champions, and we'll talk about this when talking about networks and network effects, but these network effects then of embracing the first followers as equals and not doing it as a kind of top-down, I'm the CEO and I know what's happening, but rather as an exercise that takes people as equal champions and develops it with them. And we'll talk about this in a bit, but it's all related to the question of action-driven purpose, but also how to actually really live genuine values around this. I'll never forget, a couple of years ago, I did a seminar with a couple of executives of a German multinational. And I asked them, so what are your genuine values that you really believe in as a collective? And there was silence. I asked again, come on, like, do you, tell me. And then at some point, one of them said, let me quickly Google this. And so he went on the homepage of the company to see what the values were that the marketing department put on there, right? So the value statement was essentially a marketing gig. This generation Y doesn't buy it. This generation Y, and we'll talk about this in a second when we talk about the educational aspects that Sandra then will talk about, the question of that actually a values-based approach, both in education but also then in companies, is not about having a marketing department come up with a couple of values, but about like creating genuine values that are truly co-created. There's a couple of examples. Holsti, for example, in New York. It was three guys who were sitting in Times Square, and they were writing down what is really important to us. And so they were writing down, their core values in a manifesto type, and they put it on their homepage. And nothing happens for a couple of weeks. And guess how many times it has been downloaded by now? It has been 3 years now. What is any guesses? No? 120 million times. 120 million times. It went completely viral. The Washington Post called it the new Let's Do It. The point is this didn't come from an advertising agency. This came from 3 guys who said, this is what we believe in, and then we put it out there, and then we have a couple of people who pick it up, and now investment banker make it their profile picture. Point being that this whole idea of articulating genuine values and then developing governance structures that actually represent that. So a couple of the studies we've been doing, and again, I would love to at some point, maybe another time, do a more kind of academic session on this, like more on the kind of on also the methodologies, because one of the things that came out of how companies actually then do that in practice was all around governance structures. I don't know if who came across David Stark at Columbia University. He's wonderful. He wrote about dissonance and the idea of when you have heteroarchies, so structures that are somewhere in between networks and a bit of a kind of lead function. That in these kind of in this kind of more network structures, self-regulation becomes obviously the absolute core. And what we've seen in companies is actually that they use super simple technology, like internal wiki pages, to democratize not only structures, so hierarchies, but to democratize process. By, for example, having the CEO put their goals down every week, and then every week writing, this is how I achieved my goals. Which for the first time in a lot of companies actually tells their employees what the upper echelon is actually doing, but also then increases trust, information sharing, and everything else, and builds a real trust. And so these kind of governance structures and the processes behind are very interesting, particularly with new technology. But one of the things we've been really interested in is how do you scale this? So how do you scale social impact? How do you scale different bits when you look at all these different trends? And one of the examples we've been looking at for the last 4 years, and those of you interested, we did a paper on is called Reconstructed Living Labs. And it's essentially former drug addicts in the Cape Flats in Cape Town who said, we don't trust the government, we don't trust multinationals, but we trust each other. So why don't we use simple tools or simple kind of social media to teach each other how to sell our things outside the Cape Flats with the one computer in the local hospice, how to tell our stories outside the Cape Flats, and so on. So they developed a very simple peer-to-peer mechanism of education. These are the 10 steps to use social media, and there's a computer in the local hospice that you can use. They now scaled that to 5 million people around the world in 20 different locations, including the West, without any fancy technology, but essentially by working with local community leaders and doing something which we could label scaling bricolage. So they make the best out of whatever is at hand. So, the local resources, the local human capital, local social capital, and then essentially develop a platform for people so that they can bring that to the next level, rather than throwing resources in that. And I think it comes to one of these meta trends, which is really that one implication of the sharing economy in this context is that traditionally we've always assumed that in poverty contexts, people have a lack of resources. So you wouldn't believe, so one of the people there, he literally said, look, the problem is that whenever we have a funder come in from the West, they ask us, what do you need? And then, of course, we make up all that stuff, right? We say, we need like this and we need this so that we get as much money as possible, and then we do what we really want to do. Because actually, if they would ask us, what do we want to achieve and what do you have already, then we could actually build on all the amazing social capital and human capital we already have here, and we wouldn't need that much capital resource. We just need intellectual resource and so on. So it's kind of this approach of them, for example, using this idea that looking first, what is at hand already, how do we build a platform that then actually helps to scale that up. This is really coming to the core idea that we'll also discuss then in the curriculum question, how in a networked world where it's not about central organizations pushing resources into something, but where it becomes into a networked a structure, that we need different thinking and different mindsets for this, particularly among students, particularly among those people who are running businesses and will go into business in the future. This is, I don't know who of you remembers, on LinkedIn, you could map your networks. So essentially you could, ask LinkedIn, okay, map my network around different nodes or so. And what it would do is, here you can see Brett Fitcher. He was a community manager at one of these communities. And here you can see in blue, it's one organization called Sandbox. In red, red should be LSE, but here it's green LSE. Probably not the best from a branding perspective, but so essentially you see each of these kind of different ones is in itself a community. But most importantly, you see the super nodes. You see the super connectors who are in between these different environments. And these are then the ones who have the biggest leverage, and these are the ones, whenever there are campaigns outward or inward, who are the ones that, if they are focused on, can have the biggest impact. Another example around this networked effect is, who of you remembers this volcano that broke out a couple of years ago with an unpronounceable name? Yes, yeah, exactly. Exactly, that Ayakol, exactly. An Iceland friend of mine from Iceland actually said, Christian, you guys always bother with this, like trying to spell it. Just say E14, the letter E and then 14 other letters. And so somehow that made sense. But you might remember when that volcano broke out, there was a complete shutdown of London airports, right? And at that point, there was the biggest social entrepreneurship forum in the world in Oxford, where you had all these social entrepreneurs gathering, and then the World Economic Forum had another gathering in Cambridge. And so all these amazing people were stuck in London. They didn't get out. Some of them took the boat, they literally took the ship, which apparently took 2 weeks then, but still was faster than the planes not moving. But essentially, I got a call in the morning by Nathaniel, and he had maybe 2 friends in London, and he was a member of the same community as I was, Sandbox. And he called up and he said, Christian, there's all these amazing people at the moment in the city. I want to organize a conference, and I want to do it tonight. Within 28 hours, he organized a full-fledged TEDx Volcano conference, where he got Jeff Skoll, Larry Brilliant, and others as speakers. 10,000 people on the wait list. On the recorded live stream, completely sold out. One of the most effective and influential TEDx events in that part. And the thing is that he didn't need any resources for this. He knew 2 people in London. But what he was clever at was he plugged into existing networks. He plugged into TED and said, I have a narrative, I have a story. Can I have your brand? TED said, amazing story. Here's the brand, here's a couple of speakers. Then with the TED brand, he went to the hub and said, hey guys, I have an amazing brand, an amazing thing. I just need a space, give me the space. The hub said, we love it, of course you get our space. And then he went to Sandbox and said, I need volunteers, I have all this set up, give us volunteers, and so the volunteers came in. The point is that these conferences a lot of times cost thousands and thousands of euros, pounds to produce. But actually, if they are framed the right way with a real, whatever that is, a purpose or a clear narrative or a clear idea, and if it taps into the right networks, it can be scaled super quickly nowadays. And that comes to one of the things as a last concept that I'm most fascinated about at the moment, which is really about the idea of how do we facilitate serendipity? So essentially, this idea that whenever you think about kind of some of the key incidences in your life, it might be, oh my God, such a coincidence that I met the love of my life here, such a coincidence that I met my colleague here, such a coincidence that this and this happened in my life. But what if, so that always seems like luck, right? But what if we could curate environments that make it paradoxically more probable that positive coincidences happen? So if you look in chemistry, for example, Viagra, penicillin, these were all coincidences. Nobody even knew that was out there. That's the same with innovation, right? Like in companies, a lot of times we don't really know what will come out of it. But we can set up an environment, like for example in these labs, where they set up an environment where they accelerated molecules meeting, they had an open mind to new outcomes and so on. They developed a structure that allowed for new outcomes to become more probable to emerge. It's the same with in real life. So this is, as you can see, my PowerPoint skills are quite limited, but essentially, this is my sphere of influence, this is my head, and this is one of the people I did a core project with. And in real life, we would have never met, because our spheres of influence are too small to really be on each other's radars. But essentially, by curating environments where we connect with a couple of different right multipliers, where we put our ideas on the right stages, where we kind of set up an environment of open-mindedness, it makes it more probable that someone else then talks about that idea, that someone else, in a way helps that idea incubate. And so essentially what it does is it potentially accelerates serendipity. And so in a way, when we think about all of this that I just touched on and that I hope now then Sandra will translate into what that all means for curricular development, that essentially when we look at these mega trends, what I believe it means in the kind of bigger picture for us as educators and implications for business schools is first that companies a lot of times don't really know what they need and more importantly what they will need in the future. So essentially if we just teach hard skills or a couple of coding skills or a couple of skills that are essentially about here is what it is about, it's not enough. What we need is essentially practical philosophers, people who constantly question things, people who constantly ideally use the kind of Socrates-type dialogue with people to really understand what the real problems are. When you look at the companies that are really doing well, especially nowadays on a global level, especially also in low-income contexts, it's companies that go away from the traditional kind of approach of expansion and this is how we build our business to a more design-thinking, problem-based approach that starts with a theory of change. And where does that come from? It comes from critical thinking, and more importantly, it comes from really understanding that people need to be educated into critical thinking a lot of times because that might not be the initial status. So really kind of developing a values-based teaching that is based on an idea of what are the core values that we as business people stand for, not in an ethics class, I never understood that. I feel to me, having ethic lessons, and I hope I don't step on anyone's toes here. Is anyone teaching ethics classes? No? Okay, good. Because to me, having an ethics class is always like a company having a big CSR department. Essentially what you say is, these guys are responsible for it. But ideally, it is integrated into the whole, right? Ideally, when you start the one-on-one on business, that should start with what are our responsibilities as leaders? What are our ethical and moral and other obligations? What did Adam Smith not only write about the wealth of nations, but what did he write about moral sentiment? And really kind of integrating that as one enlightened capitalism rather than as, hey, here's the shark capitalism and here's the ethical thing, and you figure it out yourself how you bring it together, right? One of our responsibilities probably is to bring that together. It's also obviously around what John also mentioned and what we see with Hire and other companies, that this idea that companies nowadays need more and more of these entrepreneurs and people who are entrepreneurially thinking and who are not only kind of thinking in terms of execution, but actually thinking in terms of networks, thinking in terms of looking at existing structures and deconstructing them. One of my students actually said the biggest thing he learned at the LSE was that everything is socially constructed. And to me, that really hit it on the head, because essentially, once you understand that every institution, every company is just made up, right? Because one had a guiding philosophy on it. But once you question that and say, why would we take for granted that profit is this and this kind of measure of success, then actually you open it up to saying, maybe we should build more responsible businesses because we question that key element. And really kind of this questioning mindset of entrepreneurs, of lateral doers, so not only lateral thinkers, but lateral doers that think in networks. Of course, all these things like coding skills and so are necessary, but just not sufficient in this world. So as a kind of closing thought, it's really about, if you look at an institution like the LSE, a lot of what we tried over the last years was to say, how do we bring together the kind of academic rigor of real good research, the kind of Academy of Management journal type, like grounded research that people like Harry and others like really stand for and really want to push, at the same time as having students that feel empowered and go out there. And I wanted to briefly share this kind of example of one of the approaches that has been tried, which took a longer time, but it's kind of more and more now, especially in this new MSc, coming more and more to the front, to really say, how do we do research where we do the research, we do it in a really kind of rigorous, rigorous way, and then we say, okay, now that we found out in the research that there are these and these challenges, are there student teams in our courses who could help and work with this organization on these challenges? So the student teams then go in, work with these companies on these challenges, come back and write their reports on it. So again, it's both kind of first fixing the problem and then essentially, doing a kind of almost like an intervention type experiment with it, and then kind of having their own research that feeds back into the uni. Then essentially us helping them to be integrated into an ecosystem and to then ideally use these applicable insights in our teaching as well. So really saying, not only having the papers here and then teaching here and then projects here, but really saying, how can we do a research project, learn from it, and then say, what are the pain points that our students could help solve, and then saying, okay, how could we integrate that into the global ecosystem to really bring that together? And I think that, being honest, I think to me that has been one of the biggest and probably most, how can I frame this? One of the experiences where I think I probably made a lot of mistakes, and I probably had a very, it's this whole idea of convincing people to say, what is a good, I try to say it because I'm very aware that it's taped, so I gotta frame it in a very diplomatic way. But so this idea that there's hardcore rigor and then there's impact. And really kind of finding a way to say, yes, that is true. If you want to write a top paper, then you've got to focus on the paper. You can't be led by other things. But does that mean that the two should be completely separated? Or could we, once this research is finished, really see that link now to actually bringing in the students to work on this and so on and so on and so on. So to really kind of integrate that a bit more. And I think at research-led universities, that's obviously quite a discussion sometimes how to really integrate the two without then losing the kind of academic rigor and credibility. And so I think that's a constant learning curve. I'd love to discuss more around this as well. So I want to finish on my favorite, which I think is underpinning all of it. And that really comes back to Viktor Frankl. Who of you, you're probably all of you heard of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the kind of, he wrote poems and he was a big thinker and philosopher. And he comes from Heidelberg, the city where I'm from. And there's this philosopher's way. And on this philosopher's way, you have the different kind of, sometimes you see maybe someone putting a quote there, and the quote that I read there when I went up was by Goethe. And Goethe, in his thinking, used the same as Viktor Frankl. Goethe used to say that if you take man as he is, or woman as she is, you make him worse. But if you take man as what he could be, you make him capable of becoming what he can be. So Viktor Frankl said the same thing, essentially. He said, look, if I look at you as a drug dealer, you will always stay a drug dealer. If I look at you as a potential teacher, you start believing you could be a potential teacher. And I believe our responsibility as educators is to say, you're not a student, and here's the student, and here's the company you always assumed you will work for, and maybe that's a company we don't necessarily all encourage to work for. Well, why not saying, hey, look, there are these different types of models out there, choose, but do it based on really this kind of deep philosophical questioning and really questioning what your purpose is in the world. And I think if we do that, then we kind of help set up these companies of the future that really help us become more purpose-driven and hopefully educate the next generation of responsible leaders. Thank you so much.